We all, from time to time, need to buy a new pair of shoes. Generally speaking, it's a pleasant experience, it's no problem. But every now and again you get that worst case scenario. The edges of the heel on the sole are too sharp, and the first few times that you wear them, it interrupts your normal walking gait so that you feel like you're walking along like a Thunderbird's puppet. The leather's new and stiff. It doesn't conform to your foot properly. It rubs, it's uncomfortable, and for a day or two at least, it's a trial wearing them rather than a pleasure. But eventually the shoe moulds to your foot and your style of walking, and it eventually reaches that Cinderella moment where the shoe fits perfectly. Now, compared to shoes, motorcycles are a very complicated machine, but in some ways the principles of running a bike in are very similar. The procedure of running or breaking a motorcycle in seems to be a procedure full of mystery and uncertainty for a lot of people. Some people say that you don't need to run modern machinery in, and it's true that the importance of breaking in a new bike isn't quite as critical as it was in days gone by. I'm talking about before my day. Modern materials and metallurgy, coupled with modern production methods, mean that modern machines are far more fit for purpose when they leave the factory than they were, say, in the 1960s. In effect, the accuracy of the assembly procedure nowadays means that, to all intents and purposes, depending on the manufacturer, the motorcycle is pretty much run in. Now, that's a little bit misleading because it's more than likely that that machine was never run until the day the dealer unpacked it. What I mean is the accuracy with which it was put together means that everything is pretty much a perfect fit. But I only say pretty much perfect fit. The bike's 99% there from the factory, but there's still that extra 1% of polishing and honing that can only be done by running the bike in a specific and careful manner over a number of miles specified by the manufacturer. Tiny marks left behind by milling machines, slight imperfections in the metal surfaces, sharp edges that in order to work correctly need to be rounded off ever so slightly, and the only way that this final part of the process can take place is to run the bike. Now, human beings are by their very nature lazy and impatient. We want a quick fix, we don't want long and complicated. And a few years ago the waters were muddied even further by a method known, I think, as the Motorman method. A method that advocates that you thrash the living daylights out of the bike from day one, with certain caveats allowing the bike to cool down, more frequent oil changes, that kind of thing. Handed to us with a provenance that this is how the racing community run bikes in, ready for racing, in order to get maximum performance from them. Now, I have seen a tiny bit of evidence that there is some merit to this method, but it is only a tiny bit of evidence, not enough to convince me that that's the way to go. A racing bike and a road bike are two very different animals, and the owners require very different things from those animals. A racing bike will be stripped down to some degree or other after every race meeting. It'll be inspected and parts will be replaced and the engine will be rebuilt. And after a couple of years that bike will be considered to be no longer competitive and it'll be passed down the chain to someone that indulges in a lower form of racing. And basically by that time, despite the constant rebuilds, these bikes and engines will be worn out wrecks despite covering what is only a small mileage. The owner of a road bike, however, requires something quite different from his bike. He requires reliability. He doesn't have the time or the money to be constantly rebuilding the engine. Yes, he wants the bike to perform well and he wants the engine to be responsive, but he also wants it to run economically. He doesn't want a bike that burns gallons of oil a year, and he doesn't want a bike that guzzles petrol. So my argument is that the Motorman method, or any derivative of it, doesn't really apply to road bikes. Now, if you're watching this video expecting some revelation of an easy, quick way to run your bike in, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed, because I advocate following the manufacturer's instructions. But what I want to do is take away some of the mystery and misinterpretations
because manufacturers' instructions are really quite vague and open to interpretation, and show you that running your bike in doesn't need to be a long, laborious and frustrating chore. The manufacturer's running in procedure is generally quite a generic set of instructions. I've owned all different bikes from different manufacturers, and the instructions given are always pretty much the same, with just a few slight differences here and there. And it's usually keep the revs below 4,000 for the first 500 miles and then gradually increase them to 5,000 revs for the next 500 miles. Now in the case of the Interceptor, it's 6,000 revs, after which time you can gradually increase the revs to the red line if you want to. They'll tell you not to overload the engine, they'll tell you not to apply full throttle and avoid rapid acceleration. Usually they'll also tell you to vary the throttle opening, and they'll tell you not to stick at the same speed for long periods of time. The first oil change can vary. In the case of the Interceptor, it's 300 miles. For most bikes, it's 500 miles. On some of them that I've had, it's 600 miles. Now that is, in general, the information that will be supplied to you for 90% of the bikes on the road. But I would urge you to find out exactly what the situation is before you ride that bike for the first time. Now when you pick the bike up, you're going to be excited, and it's probably going to be the last thing on your mind until you're 2 miles down the road. Don't ask the salesman, because the chances are he won't have a clue. Salesmen are just salesmen. A month before you bought that bike, he might have been selling toasters and TVs in an electrical store. When you bring your bike in for its first service, he may well have moved on and he'll be selling Ford Fiestas in a local car dealership. They have neither the time or the inclination in most cases to get to know the product well enough to be able to advise you. If you can, and it's much easier these days with the internet than it used to be, get a copy of the owner's handbook before you even go to collect your bike. The manufacturers usually have a copy available online for you to either read online or to download a PDF copy, and make sure that you know what the running in procedure is before you swing your leg over that bike for the first time. Now for middleweight bikes up to the larger bikes, 4,000 revs in top gear is usually quite fast. In the case of the Interceptor, it's 60 miles an hour. More than fast enough for 90% of the roads here in the UK. So really, you can ride these bikes quite normally, or at least what I would regard as normally. With smaller bikes, of course, you may have to be a little bit more patient and restrained. Now, following these instructions given by the manufacturer, my advice is this. In general, riding about, keep your revs between 2,000 and 4,000 revs per minute. Don't allow the revs to fall below 2,000 unless you're actually pulling up to a stop. And then select the gear to operate within those two parameters. Now, in a lot of cases, when you're moving in urban traffic 30-40 miles an hour, this is going to mean riding the bike 1 or 2 gears lower than you would normally consider acceptable. And this is basically to give the engine an easy time in its early days. It puts far more stress on a new engine at low speeds in high gear than it does at low speeds in a low gear. As we all know, if you're riding a bicycle at low speed but you've clicked it up into top gear, it's really hard work keeping it moving and accelerating up to a speed that's suitable for that gear that you're in. And it's exactly the same for the engine on your bike. This can cause what's known as lugging. Basically, the engine will start to vibrate and the bike will start to judder. This can cause what's known as piston slap, where so much stress is being put on the engine that the piston effectively starts to rock slightly, which can cause abnormal and lasting wear. So it's better to rev the bike higher than you would normally consider acceptable to ensure that you don't get into this situation. Now, a lot of people see that the manufacturer recommends 4,000 revs, and what they do is they impose upon themselves a safety net, thinking that they're going to be able to run the bike in better by doing it that way. So they might restrict themselves to a maximum of 3,000 revs or maybe 3,500 revs. I'm presuming with the mentality that they're going to make a more thorough job of gently running the bike in. Don't do it. The manufacturer has already built in a safety margin to the figures that is given you. He knows that engine far better than you do. He designed it, developed it and built it. When you're riding the bike, use the entire gearbox and use that entire allowed reverage through each gear as you move up. Don't just short shift at low revs until you get into top and then stay in top. Work up and down that gearbox on a regular basis. I know this sounds complicated, but it really isn't in modern traffic situations. And again, I know I'm talking about the UK. It's not very often on A roads and B roads that you have the opportunity to get a bike up into top gear at the national speed limit and sit there for hours on end at that speed. In reality, it just doesn't happen. There are always other vehicles in your way that you have to slow down for. Junctions that you have to stop at. Bends and sweeps in the road that require that you adjust your throttle and adjust your gears. So it's really not that difficult, just ride normally. This might seem like an odd thing to say, but in the first 500 miles, don't use your brakes unless you have to. Plan well ahead, look well ahead at what's going on, and change down gradually and sequentially through the gearbox using the engine to slow the bike down. Use the engine braking. This is an important part of conditioning the engine. Having said that, safety first. Cover your brakes and use them if you have to. Don't sacrifice safety for the sake of running your bike in. Now, having said that, I've seen people driving along straight roads constantly altering the throttle opening on the bike, because that's what the manufacturer's instructions give you the impression that you should be doing. As I've just pointed out, normal riding conditions will allow that variation naturally. You don't need to force it. If you do find yourself sitting at one speed, let's say a 30 or 40 mile an hour zone, for long periods of time, occasionally every couple of minutes click down or up one gear. That will allow you to maintain the same speed while altering your engine speed. Now, before your first oil change, you'll notice that the oil that the manufacturer has put into the bike is at a significantly lower level than you would normally expect to see. It's usually bang on the minimum mark. And also, quite a lot of manufacturers still use what they call a running in oil. It'll be of a much thinner viscosity to that that's normally recommended for the bike for running in purposes. This is done to minimise crankcase pressures in the early days of the bike's life. The engine will be comparatively much tighter than it is when it's running, and this generates a lot of friction, which generates a lot of heat. The thinner oil is designed to actually promote engine wear, just for the first few hundred miles to help with bedding in. And that extra heat can be a problem. Now, it won't say this in your handbook, but what I would advocate for the first 100 miles, restrict the bike to short hops of between 10 and 15 miles. Then stop and let the bike cool down for 10 to 20 minutes. The engine won't feel cool to the touch, but it will have cooled down sufficiently to prevent any thermal damage to any of the components. Now, this is not particularly a problem for liquid cooled bikes. They've got a much more effective liquid cooling system complete with a cooling fan. It applies mainly to air cooled and air oil cooled bikes. The manufacturers put less oil in that bike, so there's less effective cooling. Once you've got that first 100 miles out of the way, the engine should have loosened up sufficiently that it's not so much of an issue. But in any event, during the running in period, don't run an oil air cooled bike for more than an hour without stopping to let it cool down. And to that end, if the dealership that you buy this bike from is a long way away from your home, because you see this all the time, people buying bikes that are 200 miles away from where they live and then riding the bike home in one long journey, it really isn't good for the bike. If you have to do that, avoid motorways and avoid long runs on dual carriageways. Plan the route on A and B roads and stop every 10 or 15 miles and wait at least 10 minutes before you resume your journey. If you can't do that, I would recommend that you pay to have the bike delivered. Now, when the manufacturer says don't use full throttle, I think that's self-explanatory. What it means is don't pin the throttle back
all the way until it stops and won't go any further when you're accelerating. Just exercise a little bit of mechanical empathy. If you've got a little bit of experience riding, you'll know from the feel of a bike when you're accelerating whether you're pushing it hard or not. I would say during the running in period, 1/2 to 3/4 of throttle is about as much as you should be using. Now, a few do's and don'ts before I go. When you're starting the bike from cold, start the engine up and let it run a minute to 2 minutes before you commence your journey. Now, the object of this is not to let the bike warm up. The object of this is to get the oil circulating and get the oil up to those vital components to ensure that they're lubricated properly before you start to put any load on the engine. And during that run-up period, don't blip your throttle or rev it, just let the bike idle. For the first 1 to 2 miles of that journey, keep your revs between 2,000 revs and 3,000 revs until the engine has reached its normal operating temperature. Now remember, it's not just the engine that you're running in when you're running a bike in. Everything is new and everything is tight. It's just as important to break in the gearbox as it is to break in the engine. Everything is new and tight, and there will be more false neutrals and sticky gears in the first 500 miles than there will be anywhere else during that bike's life. This is perfectly normal. Don't automatically assume that there's a fault with it. Now, it's happened to us all. If you miss a gear and the engine revs up way beyond the 4,000 or 5,000, whichever stage you're at, rev mark, don't panic. It's not going to wreck the engine. It's not going to cause any damage. It's momentary. It's not going to do any harm at all. On most bikes, the suspension will seem a little bit harsh for the first few 100 miles or so. Again, these need to relax and loosen up, and that can take as much as 1,000 miles. If you can, ride the bike on reasonably flat, twisty roads. This will encourage maximum gear changes, which is good, and maximum variation on throttle openings. During the braking period, keep an eye on your oil level. It's not uncommon for new engines to burn a bit of oil, a situation that should rectify itself as the engine beds in. Avoid, if you can, carrying a pillion for the first 1,000 miles, but above all else, enjoy the experience. There is immense satisfaction to be had from running a bike in. And if you do it properly, what you should end up with is a bike that is reliable, smooth running, with a sweet gearbox. It'll be responsive, it'll be good on fuel, it won't burn oil, it'll have a long life, and it won't spend much time in dealerships being repaired. Right, I sincerely hope that I've covered everything in this video. I know for some people the braking period can be a bit of a nail-biting experience, and I'm hoping that I've included enough here to allay some of those fears and just make things a little bit clearer to people. Thanks very much for listening to me waffling on. I hope you've found this video useful and that you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. If anyone has any specific questions that they would like answering, please by all means leave a comment in the comments section below, but please be aware that I can't always get around to everyone. I'll be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.